We begin this hour in Ukraine, where it has been 1 month since the start of the Russian invasion.
Over the past 4 weeks, Russian troops have inflicted heavy damage across the country, creating the worst humanitarian crisis Europe has faced in decades. Russia continues to ramp up attacks on civilian targets in several of Ukraine's most densely populated cities.
However, Ukraine's defense ministry is celebrating a slight victory. Officials say a strike on a Russian warship was successful earlier today. The vessel was previously occupying a port in the southern region of Ukraine. The positive news comes as Ukrainian President Zelensky is once again calling on NATO to help provide aid to his war-stricken country. Zelensky gave an impassioned speech during a video conference with leaders from the alliance as they gather in Brussels today. The Ukrainian president is asking for just 1% of NATO's planes and tanks to protect his country from the Russian invasion. And President Biden held a press conference in Brussels after high-level NATO meetings. He announced an additional $1 billion in humanitarian aid for Ukraine on top of the $2 billion the U.S. has already provided. And he says NATO is united behind Ukraine.
Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today.
And for more on the president's address, we want to bring in Ambassador Thomas Pickering. He served more than 4 decades as a U.S. diplomat. He's the former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and previously served U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation. Ambassador Pickering now serves as the senior counselor at Albright Stonebridge Group. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. This has truly been a united front by NATO. But do you think their effort at this summit will make enough of a difference to change the tide in Ukraine?
It's a very difficult question. So far, Putin has slipped quite badly in meeting his military objectives. Coupled with an increase in NATO support for Ukraine, which the president has announced, as well as pressures on Russia's financial and economic situation, plus a possible serious cut in Russian oil exports, should be the measure of how and in what way Putin should begin to change his mind and move. There are some optimistic reports, maybe over-optimistic, that already the Ukrainians are hearing in their discussions with the Russians some perhaps more comfortable news. But that's early reporting.
Ambassador Pickering, the president addressed conversations he's had with China's Xi Jinping, deterring him from helping Russia. Let's listen to what the president had to say about this.
I made it clear to him. I made no threats, but I made it clear to him that make sure he understood the consequences of him helping Russia, as had been reported and as what it was expected. And I made no threats, but I pointed out the number of American and foreign corporations that left Russia as a consequence of their barbaric behavior. And I indicated that I knew how much he, because we had long discussions in the past about his interest in making sure he had economic relations and economic growth with Europe and the United States, and indicated that he'd be putting himself at significant jeopardy in those aims if, in fact, he were to move forward.
Ambassador, do you think this is the correct tack to approach with China? And are you concerned at all that China may act even with President Biden's warning?
First, I think it is the correct approach. With China, public recriminations get them excited, and engaging in a battle merely hardens their position. The kind of careful warning the president gave over the phone is a very valuable way of proceeding. There's absolutely no guarantee it will produce a perfect solution, and we'll have to wait and see how far China wants to go. But so far, it's been sitting more on the fence than it has been crawling over to one side or the other. The president's warning about economic recriminations and economic effects is valuable because China is, of course, heavily tied to its economy, and its economy is heavily tied in to the United States.
And Ambassador, before we let you go, we want to touch on another subject. You knew Madeleine Albright personally. She was a dear friend of yours. We would be honored to hear how you feel about her legacy, what she's leaving behind.
Yes, I had the honor to work for her in the State Department for a number of years, and I thought highly of Madeleine Albright. She was a pioneer and a groundbreaker, someone who never cringed from taking on a tough job and never failed, in my view, to give it her very, very best in everything she took on. She, as a migrant, found herself particularly tied to the U.S. and its interests because she knew the calamity of the U.S. losing its position as a world leader and how it would affect people all around the globe. There was, I think, no one who broke into the State Department the way Madeleine did and opened the door for many other people to follow, including myself, and I am very, very grateful to her for that kind of leadership and for being a wonderful boss.
A true trailblazer. Ambassador Thomas Pickering, thank you so much for joining us. We certainly appreciate your insight. We are joined now by CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Hi, Ed. So what stuck out to you about the president's speech?
Well, I think, again, just the idea now that this collective body, this military alliance, understands that an attack involving chemical or biological weapons is a far more likely scenario than they may have initially feared, because they're talking about it publicly now. We ran into the Turkish president a little while ago in the hallway who said something similar, which is that it isn't my decision alone, but he acknowledged that something may have to be done. And you heard the president say that there will be some kind of a response depending on what exactly Russia does. This could put NATO in a situation that it's not quite been in before, because this obviously is an alliance of a handful of 30 countries in Europe and North America, with various allies here across Europe and in other parts of the world. But Ukraine is not a member. That this is happening next door, however, and in the midst of a continent that is now absorbed by this situation, I think there's a political understanding by these leaders that they can't let it go unanswered. If they are the dominant and predominant military alliance, at least in this part of the world, and it's their eye that the Russian president's trying to poke, in essence, by taking on Ukraine in this way. So by him saying that there's going to have to be a discussion about that, if it happens, is a sign that something likely would come from it. But that also speaks to the frustration that Volodymyr Zelensky again expressed to this group today, that it's taking too long for this alliance to make decisions that need to be made quickly. In his remarks to the group this morning, he essentially said, your might or your reputation is being tested the longer it takes for you to make simple decisions like how many weapons are you sending our way? Where are you deploying troops? Would you be willing to give us aircraft or tanks? He made some point or reference to the idea that there are about 200,000 tanks in the possession of NATO countries, and all he'd like is 1% of them. But that it's taking too long for the alliance to make those kinds of decisions. And instead, he's got to have multiple bilateral conversations with the United States, Germany, the UK, Canada, even the Pope separately, to appeal for aid when he'd rather be going to just this location, this organization, to get that done. So, the president, other leaders here made clear they needed to have this conversation in person. They wanted to do it. He's completed 2 of the 3 meetings he's scheduled to have today. He's now headed to what's called the European Council, which is part of the European Union, to continue the discussions with the leaders that could ultimately be most affected by this, both the military aspects of it, but now increasingly the humanitarian aspects of this. The fact that they announced today a collective at least $12 billion in aid for humanitarian relief in the short term, and then for economic and food aid across this continent and other parts of the world, is a sign that they now understand, while this may be confined to one country in Eastern Europe, it is quickly mushroomed into a global crisis.
Well, speaking to that point, Ed, the president did announce that another $1 billion in humanitarian aid will help displaced Ukrainians. The U.S. will also accept 100,000 refugees. How significant is that?
That is significant, Meg, because, first of all, the Biden administration had put a cap on how many refugees it was going to admit from the entire world, 125,000 in fiscal year 2022, which is what we're in right now. the administration today says because of this influx of 100,000 that they're going to admit, and it's mostly Ukrainians being reunited with family who already live in the United States, there's going to be an emphasis on dissidents, on journalists, on LGBTQ people who are Ukrainian, who may face threats to their own life and their existence for being who they are, but it's going to exceed that cap. Well, that, to me, in an election year is going to spark an interesting conversation, certainly among Democrats, and then probably among those who worry a lot about immigration, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And they'll say, look, you've kept a policy in place during the pandemic that has kept out hundreds of thousands of people from Mexico, Central America, and Haiti. You're struggling to figure out how many more people from Afghanistan you're going to let in after ending that war. And you, of course, remember that there are potentially thousands of people still in Afghanistan who were either hoping to or assured of safe passage to the United States. And now you're going to suddenly also admit 100,000 Ukrainians. Well, that's a Pandora's box in the tricky issue of immigration policy in the United States, even as, from a foreign policy perspective, they're trying to show the world that they're willing to bring in at least 100,000 when millions have been displaced, most of them so far in Poland, where he will head on Saturday. And he hinted there in his remarks something we've been hearing about, which is that he is likely to meet with Ukrainian refugees or those that are assisting them in Poland during his visit to that country. That's a visit designed to thank them for not only shouldering the humanitarian burden, but to demonstrate that the United States stands with one of the biggest countries in Eastern Europe that is now most directly threatened by the possibility that this spills over outside the borders of Ukraine. And so, expect to hear more about this in the coming days. But I would think it will quickly become a domestic topic of debate if the administration is being so generous with Ukrainians. What about all these other groups that have been trying to get into the United States for so long?
Absolutely. Ed O'Keefe putting it all in perspective for us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ed.